Welcome back, Social 20. This is lesson 20. After this lesson, we should know more about nationalism, this little place called Canada. We're going to pick up some language during this lesson, language like pluralism, alienation, self-government, non-nationalist loyalties. We're going to look at separation. And there's a potential I'm going to assign you an assignment at the end. So let's see where I go with that. Here we go. One of the terms we can uncover by looking at this little place called Canada is divided loyalties. A divided loyalty is a feeling of strong support for opposing groups. One may be torn because of their divided loyalties, their competing loyalties. So Canada, being a nation of plurality, multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-religious, there's a great amount of potential for divided loyalties. Maybe there's a conflict between Canada and another nation, Japan. For Japanese Canadians, it could be a time of divided loyalty. Am I loyal to Canada or Japan? Pluralism is a related concept. Pluralism I often defined as multiplicity. We have multiple cultures, ethnic groups, languages, religions, and there's tolerance for their coexistence. To what extent might pluralism contribute to the creation of divided loyalties? Well, in a nation with only one religion, one language, one ethnicity, one culture, as long as those things all fit together, there is no room for division. One ideology as well. But in a nation that celebrates differences, sometimes even the differences inside one's own character may be at conflict. If we celebrate hyphenation, so I'm not Canadian, I'm German Canadian or Irish Canadian, or multiculturalism, can it strengthen Canada? In order to uncover the answer to that, there's a link here that looks at some Canadian athletes and some great Canadians that have been recognized as great Canadians. And as they're being recognized as great Canadians, they also celebrate the hyphen, the idea that they are a Canadian that some might see as having divided loyalties, but others might say, you know what, I'm Scottish, Irish, Chinese, Swedish, and Saskatchewanian. Saskatchewanian. That's just a fun word. Then there's a second article here for you to read from a friend of mine that is German Canadian, and it looks at, the potential of divided loyalties for someone that is both German and Canadian. We have some practice questions. Do with them as you wish. Then we have an actual major case study here called the FLQ. We want you to view the following Prezi about the use of the War Measures Act in response to the 1970 October crisis and connect it to the issues stemming from divided loyalties. So there's a link to a Prezi here that I made years ago, and it will take you through the FLQ crisis. It's written from the perspective of the French Canadians, who are separatists. So the problem that they see is Quebec is controlled by the English, and it always had been so. The RCMP, the government, the monarchy would always be English. The church had excommunicated those French nationalists that had attempted to revolt earlier in the 19th century. They tried democracy with the Parti Québécois and René Lévesque, but due to gerrymandering, it did not work. They went to the UN and lobbied No one listened. And they understood then that democracy would only work for the rich Anglophones, and therefore Quebec would always be their colony instead of the French nation that it should be. So they created the Front de Liberation du Quebec. So let's try violence. And they looked for inspiration by becoming a paramilitary, Marxist, separatist, terrorist group. They'll train with the Algerians, they'll train with the Vietnamese, they'll train with the Cubans, and they're looking to decolonize from Anglo-Saxon imperialism and Catholicism that had betrayed them, because the Catholic Church is often seen as a part of the French culture. So they begin in the 1960s by attacking symbols of English control in the province of Quebec, banks and universities and landmarks that are somehow connected to the oppression and the occupation. They targeted English taxi cab drivers. They fought the police in the streets. They tried to kill the Prime Minister, Diefenbaker, sorry, and that's what they want, an independent workers' paradise. Their leader was Pierre Vallier, and you can see the name of his book there. It shows that they're trying to say that in a time of civil rights movement in America, that the Francophones, the Quebecois, suffer the same kind of marginalization in Canada. So they had lots of different cells. The Liberation and the Chenier cell, shown in red, are the two that will end up kidnapping people. Here's a timeline of their events, beginning with that attempt to kill Diefenbaker. Lots of robberies, bombs, one per month in 68, or one per week, sorry, in 68. Attacking the Montreal Stock Exchange, Maire Drapeau. And now we have the climax of the story, right? The 1970 FLQ crisis, the October crisis. And it's during this time that Pierre Trudeau will infamously be asked, how far are you willing to go to, stop the, apparent insurrection, the lawlessness, the law of the jungle? And he's like, just watch me. And he ends up invoking the War Measures Act for the only time in peacetime in Canadian history, giving the police extraordinary power to detain people without arrest, search without a warrant, and in the end, it will give the police the power needed to stop the FLQ. But Pierre Laporte, the Deputy Premier of Quebec, will be killed before he is found. Pierre Laporte. This is what they said they wanted. Mostly they're trying to get attention and bring attention to the plight of the marginalized, they would say, occupied people of Quebec. Spelled Pierre Laporte wrong there. So I think you're getting it. You're getting the story here. So that's one example of people that are divided. Are we Canadian? Are we Francophone? At the time, other Canadians, other Francophones will be asked, do you support the FLQ? And some of them did, and some of them felt divided. I'm torn here. I don't approve of their use of violence, but many of the things they're saying resonate with me about occupation and these things. Not everybody agreed with the War Measures Act. Tommy Douglas, the NDP leader, famously said it's like using a sledgehammer to crack a peanut. So we got that. Then we have some more multiple choice practice. Do with that as you wish. Quite a few. Now we haven't had any terrorism aimed at separation in Western Canada. But what we have is a similar feeling of being left out, being marginalized, being alienated, being away from the core, being held on the periphery, being devalued by Ottawa. And that's what leads to alienation. And you can see that the majority of Albertans feel alienated from the federal government. Doesn't help that we're thousands of kilometers away. Does anyone know whose horse this is? So the cartoonist is making fun of these people in Toronto. They don't even recognize Western alienation. They see it as a horse. It's not. It's a buffalo or a bison. So it's that Eastern culture that just doesn't connect with the West is being exposed here. There's a short video provided here contrasting visions of Canada. I'd ask you to take a peek. Watch the video by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and then watch a video by a Western separatist. You can contrast their visions of Canada. Visions of Canada is one of the themes here. And what does your ideal Canada look like? Regionally, culturally, linguistically. So now we have a whole bunch of sources that within the sources should help you unpack some of this content. So what causes Western alienation do the following sources suggest? Here we have this idea that we're elevating the GTA, we're elevating Toronto area, we're elevating Ottawa, and maybe even going as far as Montreal, right? We're elevating the Golden Horseshoe and up the St. Lawrence to Montreal, and because we elevate them, the spotlight's on them, it casts a shadow across the rest of Canada, and we can't access that, right? What problem is implied by the cartoonist regarding trying to address Western alienation? Stay tuned for the Journal. Barbara Frum and 16 Central Canadian experts and reporters explain Western alienation. So, what problem is implied by the cartoonist is that Central Canadian experts don't understand Western alienation because they're not Western. They're Central. That, the politicians, the CBC, the CTV that discuss this and analyze Western alienation, they have no clue what's going on in the West because they don't come out to the West. They don't speak to people in the West. They haven't lived here. They're not a part of the West. Is this perspective of the cartoon? Is the perspective of a cartoonist a federalist that believes in one Canada? Well, no, this cartoon, and it's a very famous cartoon from more than 100 years ago, it's looking at how Eastern Canada is feeding, it's benefiting Montreal and Toronto and Ottawa. They're benefiting from this great cow that is Canada, that is feeding off of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. That it's Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba that feeds the cow, that makes the cow great, but it's the eastern countries, or the eastern cities of Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa that seem to be benefiting. Newer versions of this have been out there that keep exposing the fact that the federal government feeds on the natural resources of the West to funnel money into mostly Quebec. That's where you get this idea of equalization payments and all that controversy. How has Prime Minister Chrétien appeared in the following cartoons? Maybe in this cartoon he appears to be dangerous. Maybe appears to be illogical, irrational. Here he's apathetic. Maybe negligent of his duty because he's incapable, because he's maybe tired and old. Cartoonist has a unique perspective regarding Western alienation. What is it? Paul Martin says he'll travel to the West more often. You see, boys, he's not even Prime Minister yet, and he's already ignoring Newfoundland. That was a horrible accent, I know, but so the cartoonist is suggesting that Western alienation isn't much different than Eastern alienation, the true East, not the Ontario that is more central. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of cartoons here. You can go through them, and there's some leading questions for you. By looking at the questions, you'll be looking at the same topic again and again and again, which is alienation. And a big conflict is, our oil and whose oil is it, and should the oil benefit just Alberta or should it benefit all of Canada? Those sorts of things. Then there's some practice, multiple choice, because I threw lots of practice in here. So feel free to do with those as you wish. Now, what is a non-nationalist loyalty? Does not involve nation. Loyalties to your family or to the belief that animals must be treated humanely are examples of a non-nationalist loyalty. So, tribal loyalty, family loyalty, ideological, or like a creed. Maybe a sports team, like Leafs Nation. All three people that still believe that they might win a cup someday. That might age poorly if they win a cup after I, record this, and we'll see. Self-determination. Does Canada have self-determination? Well, what does it mean? Well, the government of Canada recognizes Indigenous people's right to self-determination, including the right to freely pursue your economic, political, social, and cultural development. So making economic, political, and social and cultural decisions for oneself, that's self-determination. It connects with the idea of Canada's founding peoples, the First Nations, the Métis, the French, the English. Canada would not exist in its current identity without any of those. All four are key to the nation that Canada became. More practice multiple choice. Thank goodness that the answer keys are on there for most of them. In terms of land claims, what is a land claim? What is a land claim? We got a document here that looks at all the land claims in Alberta, and it explains the group. So here the LUBCON that we talked about in grade 10 talks about the territory or the other claims that might be connected to it. We also have the Big Stone Cree there as well. So only a couple there. If you go to Ontario's equivalent to this, there's a lot more. There's a lot more. A lot more there. Here's a map that shows the treaties. So as you know, we live in Treaty 6 territory, but it's a map that shows the other treaties, and also with the treaties, it shows the years. So you can see how some treaties were signed much later than others. And you can see that there's some territories, like if you look at British Columbia, a lot of BC or a lot of Quebec, they don't really have territories. So there's still a lot of unsettled land disputes, land claims. Connected to this concept of our relationship between our federal government in Ottawa and Canada's First Nations is the idea of assimilation. Unfortunately, through the Indian Act and the Indian Papers and residential schools, the government in Ottawa has tried to assimilate, to try to, lack of a better word, destroy the Indigenous cultures and make them Europeanized. So we have this very dark and regretful part of Canadian history that's included in the concept of Canadian nationalism, that the federal government tried to promote the identity of one part of Canada's nation at the expense of the identity of these other parts of Canada's, hundreds of our First Nations, and in so doing has created a permanent, regretful stain on Canada's history. So here's some federal programs related to that, like the Just Society, the White Paper, the resulting Red Paper from the Assembly of First Nations. We have some information here about Métis land settlement. And as you may remember, when Gord Downie, the former lead singer of the Tragically Hip, when he was dying, he put together some work on promoting the voice of some of those too often muted Indigenous peoples, and trying to communicate to Canadians their plight, the plight of people that had been marginalized and ignored. And often, as we've seen, missing women and children and girls that have gone missing, and the RCMP don't seem to care, or the the legacy of residential schools and all those children that didn't make it home. So these are parts of the story that Gord Downie was trying to bring to the attention of Canadians. So there's many ways that we can get you to learn more about Canada's nationalism. One of them is something called the Great Canadian Road Trip, where you create a fictional path across Canada. We'll probably talk about this as a group to see if that's something you'd be interested in pursuing. If we do that, then there's some notes here talking about some things that you could end up looking at. Of course, there's more multiple choice practice there as well. So here's that Great Canadian Road Trip assignment. Some people actually really like it. It's time consuming though. Because it's time consuming, it may not be something you want to do in light of our time constraints being being a summer class. Then we have, to finish this up, we've got some articles about what it means to be Canadian, what is Canada, and some more practice multiple choice. So I may be so bold as saying we might pick multiple choice over the assignment, depending upon to what extent you guys are like, oh man, we've done too much multiple choice. So that's it. That's Canada's nationalism.